Good evening and welcome to episode 99 of the Political Mike podcast. The Biden administration squared off with legal challengers to its sweeping student debt relief plan at the Supreme Court this past Tuesday as the justices held oral arguments on two cases, Biden versus Nebraska and the United States Department of Education versus Brown. Paul Vallas and Brandon Johnson are two runoff competitors who could hardly be more different among the incumbent mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot's leading challengers after the incumbent mayor, Lori Lightfoot, conceded defeat in a stunning election Tuesday in America's third largest city after failing to qualify for the spring runoff. And a court filing released this past Monday revealed that Fox News executive chair Rupert Murdoch admitted in a deposition that some Fox News hosts endorsed President Donald Trump's baseless claims of widespread fraud in the 2020 election, potentially undermining the network's assertion that it was neutrally relying on dubious arguments from Trump and his allies. Here to help me make sense of this are Jerry Ford, who is a private equity and M&A associate at Sidley Austin LLP. He is a graduate of Howard University School of Law and received a master's degree in public policy from the University of Houston. Before attending law school, Jerry hosted a daily radio talk show on KJOZ 88 OAM in Texas, and he made numerous television appearances on Fox 26 News and KHOU 11 as a political commentator. Jerry, thanks for being back on. We also have Ms. Tia Toombs, a young advocate and a leader in her community. In recent years, she served as the 28th Miss Oakwood University and president of the Oakwood University NAACP chapter. Tia, thanks for being on. We're also joined with Joy Vendura, who is a 2L at SMU Dedman School of Law in Dallas, Texas. She's also a recent graduate of Oakwood University. And we're also going to be joined by Ismail Ibrahim, who is a Black American Muslim who was born and raised in the South Side of Chicago. He's a recent graduate of Howard University School of Law, and he is now practicing as an associate at a law firm in Chicago. And also a good friend of mine, Nate Honore, who also recently graduated from law school at Quinnipiac University School of Law. So glad to be joined by such distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead and start off the conversation by talking about the key moments from the Supreme Court showdown over Biden's student debt forgiveness program. Of course, most of the conservative justices aired serious doubts about the legal underpinnings of the program, but the argument seemed to leave open the possibility of a reprieve for the debt relief plan based on flaws in the pair of legal challenges that reached the high court. It's also interesting because after more than 3 hours of back and forth among the justices and lawyers, the best hope for the Biden administration and those covered by the program seemed to be that the court's liberals and two or more conservatives might agree that both the coalition of GOP-led states who sued over the program and a pair of student loan borrowers who object to the plan lacked the sort of concrete injury needed to challenge the plan in court. I'm going to open up the floor by asking you about the chances of those who are proponents of the administration's student loan forgiveness program, the chances that they have that their argument would end up winning in court.
Yeah, Mike. Look, the standing argument, I think, is the really almost the last hope that I think a lot of us have when we're talking about upholding this debt cancellation plan. Because look, I think without it, I think that the Supreme Court is going to knock it down, right? And it's not because there isn't any constitutional authority or support given to the executive branch that allows them to modify and to cancel debt. I think that there's clear authority that's laid out there. I think the issue that I have, and I think it might have been a strategic, determination by the Biden administration is the argument that they're making to justify the legal justification that they're giving for the debt cancellation plan is rooted in the idea that the 2003 HEROES Act gives them that authority. And, the HEROES Act was about, it was like a 9/11 law that basically, was about soldiers coming home from war. And it gave the Secretary of Education the ability to modify, or forgive student loans in a war or during a national emergency. What the Biden administration is saying is, well, this is a national emergency. If you read the plain language of the text, all right, if you're looking at, what the court is going to do is going to interpret the statute, and one of the first thing they're going to do is going to read the plain meaning. And if you look at the text, it's pretty clear because the text says in the statute, it says, national emergency. Well, COVID is a national emergency, so the executive branch has this authority. I think it's a reach All right, and I think there are going to be a lot of judges that will agree with that interpretation that that law 2003 really wasn't meant for this broad-ranging debt cancellation. I think that the authority is actually given in like 1965 Act, the Higher Education Act, that explicitly said that the education secretary had the ability to modify student loan debt and basically eliminate student loan debt. He had that power. So like when you're looking at like these statutory arguments, right? The first thing you have to do, look at the enabling statute, the statute that created the agency, and then kind of look at the authority that was given to the executive branch there. I think, maybe a reason, this is my thought process. The reason why that the Biden administration decided to go with this legal justification that the HEROES Act was the best way to move forward and the best argument put forward is because if you make an argument that the 1965 Higher Education Act gives the executive branch that authority, meaning the Secretary of Education authority, what follows will be this analysis of the deference principles, right? Which means basically, how much deference does a court give the administrative agencies, right? So if you're familiar with Chevron rules, Chevron deference, which is this ideal that, you give deference to your administrative agencies unless, there's some arbitrary capriciousness that's happening there. I think the Biden administration made the decision not to go with that argument because there are a lot of conservative judges, Kavanaugh in particular, who has been very critical about the Chevron rule and these deference principles and some of this administrative agency analysis. So I think strategically they decided to go against that argument. But I think their authority is rooted into that 1965 Act. I don't think the HEROES Act is enough to have this debt cancellation plan. It doesn't give it legal standing. I think it's a big jump to say that this act from 2003 that was talking about soldiers coming back from war, and the national emergency, especially when the Biden administration just said the national emergency is almost over. So we'll see what happens. But I think the strongest argument that we have now is going to be the standing argument that Mike, you talked about, that there is no legal standing, therefore the court should even be hearing this case.
What's interesting about the standing issue, Jerry, is the fact that I even heard a little snippet of part of the argument of the opponents of the student loan forgiveness program say that there's no clear connection, there's no clear link between those who have been impacted negatively by the pandemic and those who would be now eligible under the student forgiveness program. And I was thinking, well, with that kind of logic, and I know we're not, I don't want to compare apples to oranges here, but wouldn't you also be able to make the argument that it'll be hard to determine who's eligible for stimulus checks if that was the case? Who's specifically impacted economically wise by the pandemic, and then make a determination of who is now eligible for stimulus checks as a in alignment with who has been impacted. I mean, I thought that argument to me was a little bit weak, because you can always make the argument that students have been impacted because of the fact that, the whole education system has been, not derailed, but impacted in one way or another. Folks had to transition to virtual learning. Folks had to, some folks took a while to find jobs after graduation because of the economy. And so, how could they be expected to pay back as if times were normal if the economy is not under normal circumstances? But you mentioned Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh also compared this case to Korematsu versus United States. It's interesting because in this case, you had President Franklin Roosevelt ordering about 120,000 people of Japanese descent during World War II to be, restricted to a certain area, right? As a period in history that's very shameful in American history. And that was a policy blessed by the Supreme Court in 1944 with the case Korematsu versus United States. This is the case that Kavanaugh compared the student loan relief program to. He said some of the biggest mistakes in the court's history were deferring to assertions of executive emergency power. Some of the finest moments in the court's history were pushing back against presidential assertions of emergency power. And that's continued not just in the Korean War, but post 9/11 and some of the cases there. And of course, Kavanaugh worked with President George W. Bush during the September 11th attacks. Any thoughts about Kavanaugh's response and argument to the student loan forgiveness program?
Well, first off, it's quite interesting because based on the most recent reference the court made to Korematsu was Trump v. Hawaii, where they basically said we don't really consider Korematsu authoritative anymore. So it's kind of interesting to see Kavanaugh falling back on kind of using it as a comparison for a case he doesn't really consider to be binding. But the big problem with this suit is really what Jerry said. With this current makeup of the court, we see that the conservative majority is very openly hostile to the administrative state. We saw this last summer when they handed down their decision that effectively handcuffed the EPA and its ability to regulate emissions. So honestly, Biden trying to go a statutory route over and, executive action probably was the right choice. But even then, it's really numbers. We know that this is a court that is very outcome determinative. They arrive at the conclusion they like first and then work backwards from the conclusion. So again, I really think standing is going to be the Biden administration's best bet here, but it really is, remains yet to be seen. The big question really is, does the Biden administration have a backup plan so they don't get caught by surprise when they get a decision they don't like? Because the response to Roe, of course, was incredibly underwhelming, and they had 2 months to prepare for that. This litigation has been pending before the court for a while. So what is the Biden administration doing to prepare for a possible negative outcome?
So I just wanted to push back on. Well, first I want to say thank you for having me on tonight, Mike. I appreciate it. Thank you. One of the points you raised and you mentioned that you didn't necessarily you didn't see it as the most cogent argument, that being that the student loan forgiveness and how those individuals that qualify, how is that tied to the COVID-19 pandemic? And then you mentioned the stimulus checks, but one big difference is that the stimulus checks were expressly passed by Congress. So it was a lack of a connection between the purpose of, or the need and the action was kind of it was irrelevant in a sense. But here, when the president is trying to use emergency powers to do something that he's using emergency powers, like Jerry said, that seems to be coming in at the very tail end, or we're now getting to the tail end of the emergency. But on top of that, like you mentioned, there is no connection to a person who maybe had to take on more loans or was in a position that they couldn't pay their loans to qualify for the forgiveness. So it just seems to be something that he wanted to do, and he found a way to do it, which I'm just not in favor of that type of thinking and governmental authority generally.
So to push back against that, Elena Kagan said Biden's action didn't sideline Congress. In fact, it embraced congressional authority. She said Congress used its voice in enacting the 2003 law that Jerry talked about earlier from the Bush administration. She said Congress used its voice in enacting that and passing that law, allowing the education secretary to waive various rules during emergencies. She said all this business about executive power. I mean, we worry about executive power when Congress hasn't authorized the use of executive power. And so, I mean, what do you make about that argument? That this is not about Biden sidelining Congress. Rather, we're embracing congressional authority because it's under congressional authority that the education secretary should be able to, execute this student loan forgiveness program.
If I was Biden's attorney, that's the argument I would be making, because I think there is some, of course, because that's the whole point of what he's saying he's doing. He's saying Congress has this, they put the power and the power exists, Congress passed it, and Biden is using his authority under that statute to move forward. We're going to have to see where the courts lie. It's just, it's just frustrating sometimes that the legal answer sometimes isn't the right. We never get the right answer because so much of law is legal fiction. So we just kind of get where things end up. So I do take that point, but I still think that the fact that the emergency is so far in the past, and the connection and the fact that
I actually disagree, Ishmael. I think like at that time, the emergency was very immediate. Someone who was experiencing economic hardship during COVID that had to pay their student loans, the weight was burdensome. I'm actually one of those people. So having the student loans paused was very helpful economically. And then having them wiped altogether was something that would have been a huge lift off of me. And like even still, the hardships that are going on like post COVID, like the economy obviously still trying to recover. So I do see like the logic of where the emergency comes from, but I believe I agree more with Jerry is I don't really think there's much legal standing and I don't think there should be a legal issue. He's using an executive power that's within his rights.
Yeah, well, Mike, and what Tia just said, like, I think this is the issue that I have with the Biden administration's argument being rooted in the HEROES Act is because, what logically follows this discussion is what, we talked earlier about what Kavanaugh, bringing up, this law from like years ago. But, what the HERO Act is basically saying is that, during a time of war or national emergency, and, so it says national emergency. Therefore, you put the judges in a position where they have to make this kind of determination, and that's not really their role here to make these kind of value judgment determinations of how it fits. So it's too broad, and you don't want to. You can't say everything fits on a national emergency, right? So I think that's what some of the conservatives are pushing back on. But my point is, instead of making this argument that the HEROES Act gives you these emergency powers, you can just say, I have this constitutional statutory authority that is directly given to me, that was given by Congress, delegated from Congress to the executive branch, to the administrative agency. You have this authority that is rooted in the statute in 1965. You don't have to make these broad emergency powers argument because the logic is going to follow. Well, if this fits under it, what else fits under national emergency in the future, right? Well, what else can you do with this broad power if Congress says that you can do something within a national emergency? In 20, 30 years from now, can another administrative agency just take very drastic, what people might conceive to be drastic actions based off of their own broad determination of what national emergency means? So I think they should have just went strictly with the statutory argument that's very clear that the executive, the Secretary of Education has the authority to modify and eliminate debts, and that is promulgated to them through that act.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that that's really where this case is like kind of in a gray area, is the fact that kind of the biggest question is Congress supposed to step in? Like, whose power is this really right now? And I think that them posing it in the way that it has been posed, instead of that, the Constitution already protects this executive order, this executive power. We don't have to have this conversation. That's why I think the standing is kind of an issue. I also feel like it's been minimized just a little bit as to how big of a contention that is, that there is no standing, because constitutionally and precedentially, historically in this country, if you don't have standing, there's nothing for us to discuss. And so I think that I do agree with what Jerry and Tia have said, that I do agree with that approach to go with the HEROES Act, because language-wise, it sounds like it makes sense, but like I'm sure there's a statutory canon that can just wipe it out. Like it's just like it seems like the most susceptible to being shot at. And so I feel like that's kind of, I guess that's where my kind of underlying question is. I don't know what the strategy is in not just saying this is an executive power that we have. Why aren't we using it? We don't have to have a discussion about this standing and all that. And then in ignoring that question, standing is the next biggest thing. If that gets knocked out, which it wouldn't be surprising, then it's like, oh, well, I don't know what we're about to do. But like, I think that to me, that's my biggest concern. What Jerry and Tia have echoed is that I don't understand why we're approaching this as if there's like a real conversation or discussion that needs to be had about whether there is the power to do this or not.
I think to also point out too, I think Mike mentioned the damages, the individuals who actually are suing. It's not very clear like what their damages are. It's like, we don't agree with tax dollars being spent in this way. And it's like there's plenty of other things that your tax dollars are being spent that you don't agree with. So it's kind of hard to see like that argument, even with the standing being pushed through of my constitutional rights are being hurt by having this debt cleared for people.
This is what I don't understand. I don't understand the argument that this doesn't constitute an emergency. When you look at the fact that 1.75 trillion in dollars in total student loan debt, $28,950 owed per borrowing on average. About 92% of all student debt are federal student loans. 55% of students from public four-year institutions had student loans. 57% of students from private nonprofit four-year institutions took on education debt. And then 43.5 million Americans are currently in student debt. And then the impact it has on the national debt, because the amount of funding for new student loans exceeds the amount of repayments from existing loans. The government now has to borrow the difference, and that adds to the debt.
Yeah.
So what is an emergency?
Yeah, Mike, I agree with you, but I think reasonable people can disagree on whether it's emergency or not. And I think what the court is going to say is, look, it's not our role to make these type of determinations. That is the role of Congress and the legislative branch to make these determinations, whether this is a major national emergency or if it's not. I think what the court wants to do, right, is to just strictly rule on whether there's legal standing, this is constitutional or not. But whenever you put them in a position where they have to make these type of value judgments, I think it puts you in kind of shaky ground, right? So we'll see, but I do think that the strongest argument we have right now is that there is no legal standing, so therefore we shouldn't even be having this discussion.
So I do want to transition a little bit, because Lori Lightfoot is the first Chicago mayor in about 40 years to fail to win her bid or fail to even qualify for the runoff election. This was a stunning defeat, of course, for the Chicago mayor. Chicagoans have not ousted an elected mayor in 40 years. When Jane Byrne, Chicago's first female mayor, was defeated in the 1983 Democratic primary. Lightfoot, a Democrat, who was first elected in 2019 and led the city through the COVID-19 pandemic, drew scrutiny from voters and the 8 challengers she faced in the race for her handling of Chicago's crime rate. She said, "I've called Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas to congratulate them on their victories in advancing." She told that to her supporters. She said, "We are fierce competitors, but I will be reading and praying for our next mayor to deliver for the people for years to come." 2 runoff competitors could hardly be different than Johnson and Vallas here. Vallas is white, ran to the right of Lightfoot, and focused primarily on public safety. He won the endorsement of Chicago's conservative Fraternal Order of Police, and he faced accusations from his rivals of being a Republican, despite declaring himself to be a Democrat. And although Johnson, who's a Black progressive with the backing of the Chicago Teachers Union, doesn't use defund the police rhetoric, he has argued for police resources to be redirected to the city's social services agencies. None of the 9 candidates on the ballot came close to securing the 50% needed to win the nonpartisan election outright Tuesday. I want to get your thoughts and opinions about this election that's unfolding here.
Sure. As a Chicago resident, born and raised, lifelong, I remember when Lightfoot first got elected, one of her primary things that she ran on was police accountability and transparency. And during her time in office, there was just horrific details that came out about the behavior of the Chicago Police Department, like no-knock raids, and just lack of accountability. So much that like our police chief is moving back to Houston, where he's from. So it's and don't get me wrong, Lori Lightfoot, I think didn't do so much like negative towards crime in Chicago, but it's just that she ran on it so fiercely to only fall flat on her face when it actually came to putting her money where her mouth is. She just got right in line with the other police and didn't really shake anything up in the police department. And I feel like that was one of the things that always stood out for me. It's very, a personal perspective, but that's something that definitely stuck out, because I remember how hard she ran on it. And then just all during her first term, it was just case after case of non-transparency, non-police accountability. And thankfully, Chicago just passed an amazing like police reform legislation that allows the police precinct districts to have oversight of communities, of the people who live in that precinct will now have complete control over how the officers in that precinct are governed, how they're held accountable. And this is the first in the country that has like a civilian board that holds the police accountable. Now, that may seem like all great and good, but the police, the fraternity order of police, they have their own candidates that they're supporting. So it's still a lot of work to be done, but I was still a bit shocked that she lost so handily.
And you look at the polls, 44% of voters said crime and public safety were their top issues in the lead up to the election. The second place issue was, jobs, and that came at 13%, far behind safety. 2/3 of voters said they personally didn't feel safe, and half of the voters said that they were going to cast their ballots for a candidate who would get tough on criminals. In 2020, crime was plaguing Chicago, and the coronavirus pandemic made it even worse. Ahead of the Memorial Day weekend in 2020, Mayor Lightfoot, the Chicago chief of police, and even gun control groups got together to plan for a violent weekend and urged city residents to remain safe, as if asking criminals politely would do the trick. This was an election that really came down to one issue, it seems, and that was public safety and crime. It's amazing that someone who was now steering the ship during, a once in a generation pandemic or once 100-year pandemic was pretty seen as someone who was, squarely behind, Fauci and the National Institute of Health's guidelines, someone who seemed to be sturdy in terms of COVID restrictions and COVID guidelines, seemed to be the poster person for someone who was not really the best person for public safety. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I first wanted to defer to Ishmael because that is where he grew up. But, it is very personal when you live in a city, like a big city like that. But just from an outsider's perspective, I guess I wasn't really surprised. Just from what I hear about Miss Lightfoot, it was a very historic election that she went through, and her tenure there was very historic. But from my perspective as an outsider, it seems like these big cities like Chicago and New York have a hard time, have struggles with voter approval, and someone who gives all of their promises and their campaign promises. There's Lori Lightfoot, there's Rahm Emanuel. New York has people like Eric Andrews and de Blasio. It seems very hopeful when they come in at first. And I guess because it's just such a big city that you can't really keep everyone happy. So she gave these campaign promises, and I do truly feel like maybe she tried her best. But at the end of the day, having such a big city like that, it's almost like running a small country.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go, Ish, just give me like 20 seconds.
No, please.
I wanted to say from an outsider's perspective, kind of just offer the opposite side of what Tia said. I disagree. I think that to me, it seems very much like Mayor Lightfoot, or, she got into office. She really campaigned very heavily. And what I took notice of, because of the, area of law that I care about, is that she campaigned very heavily on criminal reform, policing reform, things of that nature. In a city like Chicago, that's what a lot of people are looking for. And so I think that, and then to get into office and from my understanding, and Ish, you can echo or disagree with me, it seems like almost nothing substantive when it comes to criminal policy, policing reform. I think that that's very much where she went wrong. And I think that you could tell during the tenure of her time as mayor, you could see where things went wrong, because the public outcry from the outside looking in was very real. Like the people of Chicago have not been pleased with her for a while. And I think that you know, I think, and you're right, you can't please everybody, but I think that if you make something such as policing, criminal reform, policy reform in that area such a big point of your
That's true. I
kind of
think like
then
I think where she went wrong, I'm sorry to cut you off. I think where she went wrong is making it such a huge part of her campaign, because a city like New York and like Chicago, crime is like the main focus of the citizens. And that's not something that you can tackle in 4 years. That's like such a complex issue that your campaign promises probably will fall flat on their face. So that's kind of why it was.
One more thing, and I'll let someone else jump in. But also, one other thing that stood out about Lori Lightfoot, she let herself become a meme mayor. She let herself and embrace becoming a meme with the big suits, ill-fitting suits. Always, she put on a hero costume, for goodness sakes, and I get it. But when you have that much criticism and it seems as if you're taking everything as a joke, I think that is part of the reason why she lost so overwhelmingly, because like she let herself become a meme like gladly. And yeah, so
Not respected. Yeah, not respected. Almost like Batman in Gotham, like Chicago is Gotham. And I was like, why would you let that like comparison be made of like yourself as like a Batman villain and Chicago being like one of the worst cities? It just wasn't a good look PR wise, like Ishmael was saying.
Yeah, I kind of think overall she kind of took the fall for, I think, something that has been happening in Chicago for well before she became mayor. Right, like crime has been plaguing Chicago. Well before there was a mayor, Lightfoot. I think me being from Houston, I think Houston has about like 2.5 million people, and Chicago has like 2.7. I think it's been this discussion, or this expectation over the next few years that Houston would overcome Chicago as the third largest city. And one of the reasons is because Chicago is continually losing population every single year at a very dramatic rate. And one of the issues is crime, right? So, no matter who's the mayor is, dealing with crime in Chicago is not going to be solved in 4 years. It's not going to be solved, I don't think, by a mayor, right? It's going to take more than that. But I do think what Ish talked about, like when you look at crime, you think it's a very serious issue where people don't feel safe, and then your mayor, your leader, is seen as some of a joke on TikTok and social media. I think the people of Chicago really just want, a more serious leader. Well, I'm not saying she wasn't serious, but I think some of her antics, made her seem, like a meme. But I think that issue with crime in Chicago, I think whoever the next mayor is, they're going to have a hard time too. But it's just something that I think the leaders in that city has to get a hold of, the state leaders have to get a hold of, because it's an issue that has been plaguing that city. It plagues most major cities, but it's been plaguing Chicago in particularly, I think, differently than other major cities. And I think they need to figure out, what public policy solutions can be brought about.
I also have to point out that crime only becomes a voter's priority in large cities with significant minority populations around elections. That's when it becomes the biggest media narrative, because simply it's easy. Big cities have a lot of people, so their numbers are naturally higher. But when you objectively look at the numbers, you're more likely to be the victim of a violent crime in Anchorage, Alaska than you are in Chicago. But you're not going to. But again, with Lori Lightfoot and her priorities, first off, I'm not necessarily sure that her defeat was that shocking, because again, when you talk about city mayors, she never really jumps off the page as someone who is especially popular, especially beloved by her community. And big city mayors do have their own challenges because they are, the mayor of a city that is larger in population than some states. No one calls the congressman when their mail isn't getting picked up. They call their mayor. So I'm sorry, not their mail, the garbage isn't getting picked up on trash day. So, combined with the challenges of running a big city, regular media narratives about crime in big cities, Lori Lightfoot's platform as a criminal reformer, despite not doing anything particularly reform-minded, you're never going to actually solve problems if you go about discovering solutions the exact same way that have been tried before, which is basically what she did. And as a politician, it's really very embarrassing for you to be an incumbent and not even place second in your own, re-election campaign. So, I, for one, am not going to be shedding any tears for Lori Lightfoot for a number of reasons, but I think for now, I would safe to say this is the last we've seen of her, at least in a political sense.
And to your point, Jerry, this was an ongoing issue before the mayor came in. She inherited this. CBS of Chicago, the CBS affiliate of Chicago, showed that in 2016, 4,321 people were shot in Chicago. 3 years later, that number dropped to 2,664, with 1,657 fewer victims, and that was a 38% drop between 2016 and 2019. But as 2019 gave way to 2020, the first full year of the new mayor, the trend line was about to reverse sharply. In Chicago in 2020, 4,135 people were shot, nearly 1,500 more victims than the year prior, and a jump of 36%. Through July of 2021, Chicago saw 2,528 people shot, and that's a 10% more. That's a 10% increase more in the same stretch the previous year. This was a trend that the mayor said was reversing. She had indicated that she thought that the trend was reversing. And as this started to become more abundantly clear, it was obvious that this was something that it didn't seem that she had under control, to the points that were made earlier. But I want to get your thought on it. We spent a lot of time talking about Lightfoot, but we have two new candidates for the position of Chicago mayor now. Paul Vallas, someone who a lot of people suspected to be a Republican, going against Johnson, a Black progressive. Vallas, of course, said that he hasn't been this happy since his son returned from Afghanistan. That was this past Tuesday night. I want to get your thoughts on this race between two very different candidates.
Yeah, Mike, I think whichever candidate is shown to be tougher on crime here, I think that they're going to come on top, because look, you just listed some stats from 2020, and I think it's unfair to place it on the mayor, because look, crime went up everywhere during the pandemic, right? Like during 2020 and then immediately after, for many different reasons. But I think previously, a few years ago, we had this conversation about, around 2016, about like the crime bill, and when Hillary was running, that brought that back up into discussion during that time, and a lot of people was like, well, look, in the early 90s, it was a whole different situation, atmosphere, and conversation around crime. There was a lot of people who were very progressive, who was like, look, crime is way out of control, and a lot of African Americans, a lot of more progressive people, they wanted a little more stricter rules on crime, because they said, look, my neighborhoods, like the crime is always an issue, but it's getting out of control. And I think right now the tide is maybe turning back towards that type of feeling in the air within some of these cities. I think New York City is one of those. I think Chicago is another one, where you have people who maybe 5 or 6 years ago were, advocating for very progressive type of, laws and public policy solutions around crime, who are now saying, look, we need to be stricter on crime. We need to have, a stronger, law enforcement agenda. And, I think when you look at Chicago, I think, like Nathan talked earlier about how most major cities are having a hard time with crime. But I think Chicago, you look at the numbers, they're uniquely different than your New York City, your Houston, your LA, your Baltimore's. And so I think, in this election, I think whoever seems to be stronger on crime here is probably going to come out in front, which, could have some negative consequences down the road, as we did see over the last few decades, when that is kind of put forth in the political sphere about being tough on crime, and how far people can go. But, we'll see. But I think the guy who came out on top yesterday with the most votes going, into the runoff, I think that person probably is going to win.
And I just want to jump in and say, Paul Vallas, I just remember growing up, like, he's been a Chicago political, I won't want to say animal, but he's been a feature of Chicago politics for quite some time. And I think people who are well accustomed to the system know how to get things done. Overall, when I think about things I want to change in Chicago, they're so systemic, to everyone's points. Like, Chicago is a hyper segregated city. There's areas in Chicago you can drive for miles without seeing someone of a different race. So all of these kind of deeply entrenched social issues won't be easily unpacked with one election. But I think the respectability of the office, and I think one will go a long way, and two, someone who knows how the Chicago political establishment works, because the two Dalys, Richard Daley and his father, they kind of helped, they solidified Chicago political regime for so long that made just doing business in the city like very predictable. So I think hopefully Paul Vallas can use his knowledge of the political scene in Chicago to just try to help bring things for the better in the city. So yeah, unfortunately I haven't read too much about the second candidate. I think that I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to distance himself from any defund the police arguments, because all those arguments seem very in fashion in the wake of the George Floyd riots. But I think those kind of statements have become political suicide in a lot, even in liberal cities, just because law and order is what most societies are built upon, and we all want the world to be one way, but if it's not that way, you still have to have law and order. And I'm not any friends of the Fraternal Order of Police in Chicago, because I always thought they were one of the most morally complicated unions in the country. I thought but I'll just leave that there. I don't want to jump off any bridges.
So another bombshell that happened this week was that you had Rupert Murdoch, the Fox News executive chairman, admitting in a deposition that some Fox News hosts endorsed President Donald Trump's baseless claims of widespread fraud in the 2020 election, potentially undermining the network's assertion that it was neutrally relaying dubious arguments from Trump and his allies. A court filing released Monday showed this, and the admission from Murdoch came in a libel suit voting equipment maker that Dominion Voting Systems is pressing against the TV network over its coverage of the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. I want to go ahead and play this argument from a legal analyst who thinks that Fox News is facing serious legal exposure.
To prove that Fox either knew these were lies or recklessly disregarded the truth is very high. In our country, the First Amendment protects the freedom of the press, a broad array of conversations. But here you have the damning admissions, including from the top guy, Rupert Murdoch himself, that he knew these things were not so, and that Fox, he admits, they endorsed. I think Fox is facing very serious legal exposure, and Tucker Carlson comes in for damaging reporting in this brief as well.
I think they go to trial in April. And then I think after that, if it is found that Fox loses this case, your coverage is going to be much different for the next election, Wolf. If Fox doesn't get, if Fox gets away with this, what's to stop them from pushing, further narratives in the future that are completely false? And not just them, other media companies. This case sets a huge precedent for freedom of the press, but also for how we police misinformation moving forward for elections to come.
Your response.
Well, now that we know Fox willingly pushes misinformation, is Joe Biden going to stop sending Democratic surrogates on that network? Is there going to be any kind of actual pushback from the DC insider class? Because for the past few years, political journalists have become sort of an in crowd where once you're with the cool kids, you're with the cool kids, and no one else can sit with the cool kids anymore. Instead of, doing what journalists are actually supposed to do, which is to investigate and verify and report what's real and not just what's being said. So, we see, we hear all this, oh, Fox is so bad, and then, no one actually doing or saying anything. The closest pushback I remember against Fox News from Democrats was during the Obama administration, when he tried to put the Fox News correspondent further back in the press room, and Jake Tapper threw such a fit that Obama had to walk back from that plan. The fact that no one actually cares about, obviously legally the White House can't do much about holding Fox accountable. That would be a flagrant violation of freedom of the press, but that doesn't mean that Fox shouldn't face any kind of social reprisal from its peers, from other people who say, that there's no unified, the fact that there's no unified statement from various, responsible individuals to say, in a free country, we have to let you exist, but we don't have to participate with you in what you're doing, and we don't have to prop you up to make you look better. And the fact that there hasn't been that from, the media darlings at the New York Times, the fact that this has not been a bigger story just shows, how far the political press.
I always wondered why the United States doesn't do what the United Kingdom does. The United Kingdom has relatively strict, legally binding standards for television broadcasters, especially when it comes down to impartiality, fairness, and accuracy. For example, broadcasters cannot publish opinion polls on the day of an election or referendum, and political debate moderators have an obligation to ensure that a reasonably broad range of viewpoints is heard on any given issue. These standards are overseen, of course, by the Office of Communications, a statutory body that is a government-approved entity established in legislation, and it receives and processes complaints from the public about violations of broadcasting standards. Frequent rulings on whether a violation has taken place, and occasionally brings sanctions against broadcasters. Why is it that the United States can't have a system similar to Britain, where there's more accountability, a higher standard to reach in terms of, sharing the news? Fox News has become information station for anyone who's susceptible to believing conspiracies, anyone who wants to believe in these conspiracies. And I wish I could say I was surprised that Rupert Murdoch knew that, his people were putting out lies, but I'm not surprised.
I mean, your answer is because of the Constitution, right? Because the United States Constitution, we're governed differently than Britain. But I think, Fox News historically has always made this distinction that, their news programming is during the daytime, but then after like 4 p.m., it is like entertainment, and it's like their personalities or their talent. And, this isn't a actual like news show, just like a show for entertainment. And they have placed that disclaimer to, I guess, try to prevent some type of, legal issues that might come about with some of their talent, in like Tucker Carlson and back in the day, like Bill O'Reilly. But I do think this case is going to be interesting. I think if I'm Fox, I'll just basically make you prove the elements here, right? And it's going to be a tough call. If they can prove the elements that this was actually defamation, but it's going to be very difficult. I do think if there is like a ruling, for against Fox News, I think that's going to set a precedent. It's really going to shake up, I think, the cable news world, because I think Fox News isn't the only news channel that kind of does this, where they say their daytime news programs are actually news, and then in the evening it is basic entertainment or just opinion. So you have to prove that some of these opinions there's no reasonable justification for to have these point of views. But like Mike, I think in a perfect world, I think we would have certain principles that like the UK have when it comes to their media. I think there could be a lot of journalists could really regulate themselves and have some of these principles within their own industry. But I think you run into issues dealing with the Constitution when you try to, I think, regulate a free speech here.
But this is the thing, Jerry.
First off,
but Jerry, Ishmael, and I know Nate, you went to law school too, but the two of them we were in the same con law class together, and we went through the elements of what would constitute strict scrutiny as it pertains to the First Amendment, intermediate scrutiny, rational basis. And to me, if we're going to use, for instance, strict scrutiny, I think the government does have a compelling interest in the welfare of the citizens. Look at January the 6th, the violence that unfolded, the chaos that unfolded on the nation's capital. You look at Nancy Pelosi's husband. You look at all of these things, and you trace them all back to the same station, Fox News, right? Even before January 6th, and Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked, you had a gentleman send or mail box bombs to the residences of Obama, of the Clintons. I mean, you have incident after incident, and you trace it back to one place, and it's the source of lies, Fox News. Why is it that we cannot put in place restrictions and while keeping in alignment with the principles of the First Amendment? Because the compelling interest here is the public welfare, the public safety of the citizens. And as long as this station is going on, putting out lies, people's lives are at risk, right? Government officials are going to be at risk. We might have another January 6th, but this one might have actual bloodshed as it pertains to legislators, elected leaders. I mean, it just makes sense to me to stop it before it gets that far.
Well, actually, this actually ties in with what I was going to say, but Fox's biggest shield in the question that you're asking, Mike, is not just that Fox is a news organization or covered by freedom of the press, but Fox's content is overwhelmingly political speech, which is also protected under free speech grounds. So, there's not really an action that the government can or really even should be taking to kind of curtail Fox's influence. That would be a gross overreach. And even with the British system you talk about, does it really work that well when BBC is constantly in trouble for being the media arm of the Conservative Party? And with what you were saying, Jerry, about the daytime hard news, evening entertainment dichotomy, really that's an illusion too, because we watched the Trump administration where Trump would call into Fox and Friends in the morning, talk about what he was going to do, and then at night go on and watch Sean Hannity and let Sean Hannity dictate foreign policy. So there's not actually this dichotomy when you've got the president of the United States, calling into your shows frequently to, talk about whatever he wants to talk about. And it goes back to Fox's origin, which is that Fox is a political organization first and a news organization second, with the express goal of getting Republicans elected. When we talk about other outlets like CNN, like MSNBC, they don't make any effort to hide either. Like MSNBC especially is the favorite punching bag. MSNBC has never made an effort to hide the fact that they're run by true blue dyed-in-the-wool Democrats who want to see Democrats in every office. It is what it is. But Fox has the express political intention of getting Republicans elected. They're political first and news.
I just want to cut in really quickly. I do not see Fox News as a political organization. They are an entertainment organization. Rupert Murdoch famously said, "I don't see red or blue, I see green," meaning money. So that is his main objective. It just so happens that the Republican Party also values money and corporate interests. So they use the entertainment aspect of Fox News to push through politics and make money. And kind of to push back on what Nathan was saying earlier is, why do we continue to engage? We all know that it's a conspiracy machine, that it's a propaganda conspiracy machine. And there's plenty of people stuck into that. So I feel like by having those players like Pete Buttigieg or Bernie Sanders that go on, that's the only voice of reason that can kind of cut through that entertainment machine, because there are people who sit there and watch Fox News day in and day out and just become brainwashed of the entire thing for the purposes of money. So yeah, I feel like before this Dominion lawsuit, it was okay to go in and kind of break up the monotony of the conspiracies. But now I do kind of agree with Mike that there should be some consequences. I don't think legally, but I think like some sort of sanction against Fox of revoking their press pass at revoking their press passes at the press conferences every morning. That could be something, but legally I don't think that's like you said, the Constitution kind of protects them. Even though they are entertainment, they do hide under the guise of a political machine.
Not under the guise. Roger Ailes literally quit MSNBC so that he could use a new cable news organization to get Republican views on the TV screen. That was literally kind of the whole point of founding Fox, News at least.
Fox, and Rupert Murdoch went along with that because he saw dollar signs.
Yeah, but its organizational purpose itself by the organization's founders and spearheaders and trailblazers was to propagandize for Republicans so that we could have things like tax cuts and, oil drilling in the North Pole. But, I do agree with you with what you said about how how the government's reprisal cannot necessarily be a strict sanction against Fox News, the entity or organization, but we can simply refuse to play along with their game.
Yeah, I agree. I think like their hands are tied. Look, if anybody knows about Fox News, and their lies, it's me. Like a couple years ago, they ran Fox and Friends ran a story, particularly about me, that was completely false on their national television show, and like it's the legal, avenues that is there to kind of combat some of their programming. I mean, it's very difficult because you run into a lot of issues, like Mike, as you said, with like the First Amendment, but. I wish that we could have, stricter like principles and a regime there to kind of protect the American public from these type of conspiracies and this type of organization. But I mean, they're going to do whatever makes them money and help their candidates become, to get into office.
And but I just want to jump in and say the Democratic or some leftists, I don't want to wrongly label anyone. Some leftists don't do themselves any good by discrediting everything on Fox News as a conspiracy theory. For instance, like through the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people on the Democratic side of the aisle acted as if there's only one line of thought on this issue, whether it be the origins of COVID, how we should handle COVID, whether vaccines should be mandated. That was completely a Democratic dominated issue. And for a lot of people, they didn't appreciate the way that issue was dominated in their lives, especially with the vaccine mandate, with the lockdowns. So and to Nate's other point, like the Republican Party isn't the only party that like money and corporate interests. The Democratic Party is very, very deep into corporate interests and overseas wars, and both parties need to be reined in by the citizenry. So that's why I think Nathan's initial point about having social consequences is the key to this issue, because I don't know, as an American, we have to like appreciate the amount of liberty that we do have. In other countries like London, when COVID-19 happened, they basically passed a law that now gave the police more Fourth Amendment. They don't have a Fourth Amendment, but just to kind of get the point across, it gave the London, it gave the police more Fourth Amendment powers to stop and seize people. So we have to really not throw away our freedoms to solve a simple problem, and kind of like look and to see how are we being accountable to this situation, and try to handle it, as educated citizens.
To Nate's point earlier about the content-based, I guess, barrier in the place of doing anything legally. I mean, the fact that it's content-based only means that the court will apply strict scrutiny. And to me, I think there's more than a compelling interest here when we're talking about the safety and well-being of the public safety, right? That's a constitutional protection. Like that is a constitutional area in which the first article of the Constitution gives Congress that authority to enact laws that are in alignment with the health, well-being, and safety of the public. I mean, and if you pass a law that does something to mimic or imitate the system in Britain, say you have now a requirement where you have to present more balanced television, not just a slogan that says more balanced, but actually have a counter argument that presents something. And to me, that is a first step towards this downhill spiral that we're going on, where disinformation is widely accessible and people are acting upon it and taking violent measures. So to just say the First Amendment allows it and do nothing, to me, is ridiculous.
I don't think that we should do
They're being
nothing.
sued right now. We have
like a major tightrope to walk, because we already know like the retaliation of it all, of like tit for tat. We do something to put them in check, and then when they get get back the House or get back the Senate, they do something else that kind of hurts us. Like any reason to impeach Biden, passing some executive order to kind of rein this in is grounds for impeachment. So I think it's like, it's for you, it's very simple to think like, oh, let's just do what London did. But for me, it's like the not even just the legal ramifications. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's saying basically the more uneducated version of secession. She says America needs a divorce. So that type of rhetoric, that type of speech is already out there of like the disaster of America is already being laid down in place. So I think like Nathan, like the social ramifications might have more of an impact, and like revoking press passes might have more of an impact than actually legal ramifications and passing legislation.
Yeah, and like we have to, our system does have forms of accountability. They're being sued, and from my analysis of the case, I think they're going to lose a lot of their coverage around the Dominion and the voter and the claims of voter fraud were pre-recorded. So it's this extra layer of premeditation of, hey, we filmed this, now we're going to sit on it and then play it back. So you had that extra time could have been used to should have been used to validate what was being said. So we have forms of checks and balances, and I take your point, Mike, I'm sympathetic to your goal of wanting a more balanced political discussion and not having people frightened and scared into always thinking the next conspiracy or being brainwashed by Fox. I just think that, like to what Tia said, I think we might not want to open that can of worms, because when the Republicans get in House, if there's some new law they may skew it their way or something. But I think just generally it doesn't really gel with the political freedoms and First Amendment freedoms that we enjoy.
So CPAC is going to be this weekend, and there's going to be some notable absences. You have Ron DeSantis, the closest opponent to Donald Trump in polling, not going to be there. Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chair, will not be there. The Republican establishment, is down on CPAC, but for Donald Trump and his campaign operation, the Conservative Conference is not just the main event. It's a crucial early test of his political strength. This, of course, is the event that Reagan gave his City on the Hill speech. The summit in National Harbor is expected to be a love fest for Trump this year, a moment to once again flout his dominance over the conservative activist movement as he campaigns for the Republican presidential nomination. If this weekend's event mimics the conferences of recent years, Trump is preparing to bask in the glow. But that also raises the stakes for him. A poor showing in the crowd or in the CPAC straw poll could feed chatter that his grip on the GOP is failing. And there's been a clip going around of a Fox News news anchor going around at a Metro diner in Point Verde Beach, Florida, taking the opinions and the temperature of potential voters in this diner. And I want to play that clip right now.
First off, Metro Diner here. I got a question for you. Ready? All right. 2024. Who's pumped up for the election? All right. Rapid fire. Who's your man? Who's your woman?
My man, Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. Christie, no. Christie, no.
Who's your man?
Trump.
Or woman?
I'd say Trump.
Trump. A lot of Trump fans.
Trump and Nikki Haley.
And Nikki Haley.
Donald Trump and Nikki Haley.
All right. So far, a lot of Donald Trump. I see Governor DeSantis. What about President DeSantis?
I like it.
Who's your pick?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. Trump or DeSantis? I'm either or.
That's an interesting exchange he had with some folks there. Everyone seems to be, for the most part, most folks are saying Trump. But, and I've heard it from, Joe Scarborough and other conservative, members of the media. They were saying, for the past few years, even before Trump, the CPAC seemed to be going a libertarian direction, which is why Ron Paul kept winning year after year. Then his son Rand Paul won right before the 2016 election. But now it seems as if this might be a potential office for Trump, which is what he needs going forward, especially in light of the ongoing litigation against him. This could be the thing that distinguishes himself from his opponents. You know, the fact that he's got these lawsuits rolling around him could possibly be an asset for the primary, not necessarily for the general, because, you know, there's this kind of like rebel, element to Trump. You know, he's bucking against the system. He's going against the system that's trying to tie him down and nail him on legal charges. And it seems as if this is the guy that, you know, has always been the original, right? Make America Great Again champion. And why change horses when, you know, such high stakes are at play here? What do you guys think about it?
I think Trump is gearing up, and I think this will be I'm very interested in seeing how DeSantis fares against Trump as we move closer to the election. But I think Trump knows how to tap into the American emotion. He beat Pete Buttigieg and Biden to East Palestine, Ohio, in a absolutely tragic natural disaster that town is currently dealing with the rail car derailment and the leaking of all kind of toxic chemicals. Like as Joe Biden, how are you in Ukraine worrying about a foreign war that has all kind of
no. That Ukraine trip took months to plan. So first of all, it couldn't get canceled.
I understand.
And also, sending the president to an already volatile situation would not have helped that.
Wait. So you mean the American citizens of East Palestine wouldn't have wanted their president to correct that?
Sending a president to a city creates a lot of influx that messes with the city. There's a lot of
that's the reason why you think he shouldn't have.
They were already going through a tragedy, and I don't think throwing Biden into that would have helped them.
The EPA was
someone who with power and, you know, gravity to come to you and say, I see you, I hear your problem, and I'm going to do something to help you. That's why you see presidents, you know, putting on quarter zips and going to hurricane disaster sites, because it's important for them to go out and tell, you know, their constituents, I'm with you. So it is very shameful, actually, that Trump got to East Palestine before Biden did.
I don't agree.
It is shameful that the judge, you know, also got beat there as Secretary of Transportation.
Okay, let's look at the record, though. 2 hours after that incident happened, the EPA was on the ground in Ohio. This, like Tia said, I mean,
Mayor Pete doesn't oversee the EPA. Homeland Security does.
It wasn't okay. So, Nate, to your point, you were saying that seeing the president there during a natural disaster, it helps you to relate to the people. Honestly, to me, it's just a little bit of a PR stunt. I think there's other ways to help. It wasn't a natural disaster. The EPA was there. Undermining the state's government, you know, DeWine said he had it under control. He probably said like, oh, we don't need you. We don't need your money. So that all of those things factoring in, I kind of don't feel like Trump got there first is the argument that you think it is.
Oh, no, but I think it looks good for him and his political career. Like, why don't you think that looks good for him? You just think people don't care about that?
It looks good for him PR-wise because his people are there. There's a lot of Republicans in Ohio in that specific area. But, you know, he should have been there. It was his regulations that he rolled back. It was Obama's regulations that Trump rolled back that caused this in the first place. So, yeah, of course he should have been there.
So Joe Biden's biggest strength has always been his ability to get in people's faces and connect with them. So no matter how you slice it, the fact that he was not, you know, on the ground, I understand East Palestine is a super red area in a state that gets redder by the day. And this is not going to have, you know, the 2024 implications that we think it will. But these are real people who are being affected by an environmental disaster. There needs to be current leadership who is on the ground saying, I'm with you, even if it's only for a second, even if he goes, you know, comes out of a helicopter, shakes a few hands, kisses a few babies and goes back to DC. He needs to show his face there. It's the proper thing to do to, you know, as the president of the United States.
Let's be clear. Within the past hour, Biden promised he's going to go to East Palestine. That aside, Biden and his team could argue, while we're fighting for democracy, right? Before this situation happened, Trump and his cronies on Fox News were out there kissing Putin's boot and cozying up to him and saying that Putin was actually on the right side of history here and actually criticizing and casting doubt on the amount of money that the United States is getting to Ukraine. Even now, you have people
Why
saying,
are we talking about Putin? All my chickens are dead.
listen,
And I can't drink my tap water. What does Putin have to do with my tap water?
We're talking about optics here. So yes, Biden had to, Biden's on the world stage, right? Biden has, so when you're commander in chief, you got to be able to put out multiple fires. And so yes, Biden couldn't make it at the time that Trump made it to East Palestine, but Buttigieg did. 2 hours after the disaster, Biden's Environmental Protection Agency was on the ground, making sure that they had, a plan in place to ensure that, lives were being saved. Now, Trump, of course, has all the time in the world to make all the trips he wants because Trump has no responsibility. He's not the one that has to live on his life on agenda or schedule. And, he doesn't have the level of responsibility that Biden has right now. So, to compare these two, to make that comparison, I think, to say politically wise, he should have been there for the looks and the optics. I think it's unreasonable because of the amount of things going on at the same time. But that doesn't discredit the fact that Biden is making a trip there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree strongly with Mike and Tia here. Look, as somebody who's from an area that is constantly hit with hurricanes and natural disasters, I can tell you this like up front that a presidential visit right in the middle of a disaster or the days after actually does more harm than good, right? Because the amount of resources that are needed for a presidential visit are being all the resources are being taken away from the victims who need it and the attention to make sure that the president has the proper security, and all the resources are put on that presidential visit and taken away from the people who actually need the help right away. So it's really probably in the best interest of the people on the ground for the president to visit an area of a natural disaster maybe a week or so after the incident happens, because you don't want to take resources away from the people that's on the ground. I think you don't want to get into a situation where you're comparing the Ukraine war and what's happened in East Palestine. I think for Biden, it took many months ahead of time to plan this trip, but then two, I think what's happening right now in Ukraine. I mean, the ramifications of this on American security is probably the most important time right now in American history in the last 30, 40 years. I even say that ramifications that what the administration does right now with Ukraine is going to have more of an effect on what the Bush administration did after 9/11, because you could have run into a risk where you have China invading Taiwan in a couple of years and just everything just breaking loose, and American security is being really being harmed here. But I think you don't want to make that comparison. But my last point is just that I understand the optics, right? George Bush got hit on it hard after Katrina about flying over. His justification was the same way. I think a lot of people actually who's on the ground and on the Gulf Coast, right, in Louisiana and Texas, they understood what George Bush was saying, which is, you have to have the people on the ground at the time who are focused on helping the victims and putting the resources towards the victims. But when you have a president who's on the ground, right, it's different from a secretary. I think Pete should have been there. But I think when the presidents make a visit, I think the whole entire city stops when that happens, right? And you don't want to do that right away. I think most presidents, make sure that when a natural disaster hit, they don't go right away. They wait for a few days or a week after.
Well, I think what's also significant about the contrast between Ukraine and East Palestine is that, because you mentioned that this is about America's safety, I don't really see the direct connection between Ukraine and America's safety. I think that
nuclear war.
But what makes you think we're not, by supporting Ukraine indefinitely and not urging them for peace talks, what makes you think that's not encouraging nuclear war?
There were peace talks.
Huh?
There were peace talks.
But I'm saying that
this is a conversation about authoritative regimes versus democracy in a country that has a sovereign, right?
China is an authoritative regime, and we don't have any issues with them. What we're doing,
So here's the clear ramifications. If Russia can take over Ukraine, right? China is watching this very closely, right? Because China right now is planning on invading Taiwan in the next 5 or 10 years, right? If the United States just hands off here, right? A lot of our allies are going to be invaded by the Chinas and the Russias of the world, and that has a direct correlation on the security of America. And when you have these free nations and these democracies who like you believe in sovereignty, right? You believe in a country shouldn't be able to be invaded by another. And if the United States and the West, doesn't react and just let a free nation like Ukraine be overtaken.
That's hogwash. Like our own nation history has spat in the face of the principle that you're standing up for. When Russia and Cuba wanted to become allies, how did the U.S. respond to that? Did they say, okay, you have your sovereignty, you get to make your own decisions? No, they relied on realpolitik, saying that this country is very close to America, so we're not going to allow you to have certain sovereign choices. That's what this issue is really about.
What you're missing there is the historical debate between the free world and the non-free world, right? Like the issue with North Korea and South Korea, the issues with Cuba and Russia being somewhat allies, and the United States and the West. It comes down to a very fundamental principle of freedom, democracy, like personal liberty.
What if someone has a democracy and they vote to become a non-democracy? Like we have this idea that democracies are the end all be all of good government. It is the one that I think is least prone to corruption. Just thinking back to, because all governments have forms of being penetrated by corruption. But I
think the Muslims in China who are in the conversation clubs.
No, I just want to understand.
I want to hear this argument for a second. Are you really arguing for authoritative regime right now?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Jerry made a point that I respect country sovereignty, but when I brought up the point about Cuba and Russia allying, he brushed that aside and said, "Oh no, I'm only talking about free people, like free countries." But so are you just brushing?
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I was bringing context to that debate.
The U.S. intervened when Cuba and basically sanctioned Cuba and didn't allow them to have their own political freedom because they were so close to the United States. And that's very similar to the situation of Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is very close to Russia. So Russia is saying that, hey, we don't want a military alliance on our border. And the US basically did the same thing with Cuba, but all of a sudden, it seems that
no, actually they're quite different. I think so. The argument with Cuba and Russia, you're talking about an alliance. So interfering with an alliance is separate versus one country invading another. America never invaded Cuba.
But we tried to kill their leader, the Bay of Pigs. Are you familiar with that?
We also did try to invade Cuba, but I think we've gotten a little distracted here because when we're talking about the merits of the war on Ukraine, look, the merits of the war on Ukraine don't really have an impact on the people of East Palestine, at least not immediately and not substantively. And they, of course, would much rather have, not have to boil their drinking water and bury, their dead pets. But even then, we're still distracted because I think the original question was about how Trump is going to do at CPAC. Now, I'm sure in that ad you showed, Mike, Nikki Haley was thrilled to hear her name mentioned by 2 people. And I think if she can crack 5% at CPAC, she'll consider that a big success too. But with all the talk about how CPAC needs to be a huge success for the Trump campaign, I'm not sure it has any chance other than to be a huge success for Trump, because Trump is the only Republican luminary that's going to be there. CPAC over the past few years has become inextricably linked with the Trump brand. And it's put the Republican Party in a very difficult spot because Ronna McDaniel, as much as I dislike her, is not a stupid woman. She understands that Trump is starting to become more and more of an albatross around the Republican Party. But she also knows that Trump brings a lot of dollars. He brings a lot of voter enthusiasm. And as chair of the RNC, her job is to get voters and get money and, get money for the party. So, she can't do too much. And that's the same problem that the current declared Republican candidates have, Nikki Haley and that other guy, and Ron DeSantis to an extent. They know Trump is a problem. They know someone is going to have to give him the knockout punch. They just don't want it to be them because they're afraid of the blowback. But if you're afraid to punch because you're afraid of getting punched back, maybe you shouldn't be in the fight in the first place.
Let's be clear. The question was asked. What does the United States have to do? How do we directly benefit from providing aid to Ukraine? And, look at the fact that the United States has had a vital national security interest in a stable and secure Europe going back to the end of World War II, the past 70 years. This reflects the core security, political, and economic interests that provided the rationale for the formation of NATO in 1949. Trump has spent a lot of his political career undermining and casting doubt on the significance of NATO. So a Russia victory with Ukraine would have a major negative impact on the stability and security in Europe. And of course, that would have a negative impact on us. You know, it would disrupt the world order. And that's in addition to what Jerry mentioned earlier. Other countries are watching, right? There was also leaked documents that Putin plans to take Belarus. So he's not stopping at Ukraine. And then going back to this, because Tia made a good point earlier, and I think it was overlooked. Trump himself is to blame for this environmental disaster. Trump's administration rolled back more than 100 environmental rules in total, and that watered down several regulations at the behest of the rail industry. He withdrew an Obama-era plan that required faster brakes on trains carrying highly flammable materials, shelved a rule that demanded at least 2 crew members on freight trains, and dropped a ban on transporting liquefied natural gas by rail. And that's directly related to what we're seeing in East Palestine. So if we're going to talk about East Palestine and trips, I don't care if you came to take a photo op. I care when it comes down to policy. What did you do to prevent or actually allow this situation to happen? And when you compare the administration currently in power and the previous one, there's no competition. The previous administration allowed this situation to happen by rolling back the regulations that would have prevented this exact disaster from happening.
Mike, so we can talk about policy, but sometimes you just need something to make you feel good. When you're sad, do you eat a salad or do you eat a candy bar? You eat a candy bar.
Trump has a lot of nerve to roll back
you need a
these
little bit of that,
regulations and then pull up and shake hands and kiss babies. Like, that's a lot of nerve to be the direct cause of this accident and kiss babies. And I feel like no matter what Biden did, there still would have been something to nitpick at. So it's like they're never going to be pleased. If he went to the photo op and caused all this major disruption, they would have said, oh, hey, like he doesn't actually want to help. And so, I mean, save it for me. Save it.
But I also think we need to check our narrative around the Ukraine war as if the whole world is united. India is still buying oil from Russia. China's still buying oil from Russia. The BRIC countries aren't distancing themselves from Russia. Like it's on in America, we have this kind of view that the world is united against Russia, but that's not what you see in fact.
Nobody said the world was united. Like I think people are very clear that this has been an issue between the free countries, right, like the West, versus a lot of these authoritarian.
India is the largest democracy in the world, and they still deal with Russia. They're free.
No, but India is a lot more complicated, right? It's a reason why they are not, like saying anything right now, because I mean they deal heavily with China and Russia. It's in their economic interest to kind of be neutral here. I think you saw with Sweden did the same thing. They were pretty neutral at the very beginning. But I mean, there's it's more nuanced there. But ideal when you take a step back, when you really just look at the history of the last 5 or 6 decades, you look at a lot of these conflicts throughout the world. You can really break it down to really this ideological debate between the way that society should be, like the social contract society between like freedom and democracy versus people I'm assuming like yourself who believes the government should have a more authoritarian strong arm over.
First of all, I didn't say I believe that. I said people have a right to decide how they're governed, and that's not democracy.
I agree that people have the right. The people have the right, but the government have the right to decide how people should.
The whole premise of people having the right to decide how they're governed is democracy.
But
so how are you going to say they have the right to decide to be under authoritarian regime? That's not democracy.
Like I said earlier, the Muslims who are in China, who are in the concentration camps, I think they will strongly disagree with you right now.
But we act like we're the shining knight when we killed 2 million people in Iraq.
Nobody's saying America's perfect.
We can acknowledge our past and still do what's right in the present. Like I don't understand how you can't separate our past sins from our current.
I'm just saying that do not hold democracy up to me as this as this free people and free nations when these free people and free nations still go over and dominate other people? Like, why should I believe one is better than the other if they both launch baseless wars? They still violate the rights of people as they see fit. And not to mention that we like to say we're a democracy, but our citizenry is so woefully uneducated that they can't even put proper checks and balances on the country that we have. So I think we're a democracy in name only. And I know it makes people, or we're a democratic republic in name only, but no, I don't want people to have to live under authoritarian regime if they don't want to. But I feel that like America doesn't get to dictate how other countries are run.
I don't think anybody believes the American experiment has been fully realized. I think most people will tell you that it is the goal of every generation to get us closer to that American experience, right? So like, I mean, experiment, right? So it's American dream to become realized of a country of free people, rooted in liberty and in individual innovation and creativity. But the idea like yes, we're not there yet, right? The country's not perfect. I mean, there's a very
I'm not trying to hear that in
there.
the wake of the Iraq War. I'm not trying to hear we're not perfect when 2 million citizens died from being invaded under false pretense. Like I'm just not that doesn't move me in any way.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, we're gonna have to agree to disagree tonight because we have reached the time to wrap it up. But I just want to thank you, Tia Toombs, Jared Ford, Nate Honore, and Ishmael for and Joy Vendura, who had to leave a little bit earlier. But I want to thank each of you for what you brought to the table. I thought this was a really refreshing discussion. It was a necessary one. And I thank you for what you brought to the table. We can bring different perspectives, different opinions to the table, still respect each other, and leave, even sharper than before. I want to encourage the viewers again to challenge the sources of news that you do plug into, to compare fact with fact, and make sure that you refrain from misinformation and disinformation and sketchy sources of news. They're so accessible. I also want to encourage you to tune in on Monday. I'll be having a one-on-one interview with Les Francis, who was the former deputy chief of staff for the Carter White House. It was going to be a really great discussion. It's going to be Monday, 7 p.m. I hope you tune in. Thank you all so much again for what you brought to the table. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 99. Episode 99 of The Political Mic. Thank you all so much. Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mic podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMic, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.